Sure. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Laura. I'm a librarian at the Cedar Mill Library. I'm not usually an active participant with the Writers Mill, but I'm helping them while we're in a pandemic and they're not meeting physically in the library. But today I'm very excited because I get to introduce the guest speaker, Erik Nebel. He's a local writer. Erik's first book of comics was published in 2014 by Yeti Press. Their work has appeared in Best American Comics 2015 and 2019. Most recently, Erik finished work on a graphic novel adaptation of Tolstoy's War and Peace, which, side note, I'm very excited about because I never finished the entire actual novel. But with the graphic novel adaptation, I will try again. And today's presentation is entitled Comics and Graphic Novels, From Inspiration to Creating, Publishing, and Marketing. So without further ado, go right ahead, Erik.
Thank you. Thanks, Laura, and thanks to the Writer Mill for inviting me to give this presentation. And thank you, everyone, for being here. My hope for this presentation is that it gives you a window into the world of comics, which is exciting to you. But also, I hope that it gives you a perspective into the creative act that can be useful to you, whether it's drawing or writing or anything else. And I thought I'd start off, since I am talking about comics and graphic novels, I'd start off with a question that some of you may have, which is, what is a graphic novel? And so I will show you. These are graphic novels. They are, this is in paperback and this one's in hardcover. And a graphic novel is basically comics in book form. And this one is in color, and this one is in black and white. Show you a little. And this book was made by a friend of mine named Daria Tesler, and the book is called Cult of the Ibis. It was published by Fantagraphics Underground. They're located in Seattle. They're one of my favorite comics publishers. And this book is actually available at the library. So please check it out. And thank you, Mark, for purchasing a copy for the library. I am going to start the slideshow now. So I will share my screen. And here we are, comics and graphic novels. This will be my personal journey from inspiration to creating, publishing, and marketing. Before I launch into that journey, I'll tell you just a bit about myself, a little more. Here I am a speech language pathologist when I'm not drawing comics, and I work in an elementary school. I work for the Hillsborough School District, which has been wonderful. And here I am, I'm teaching a comics zine workshop. A comic zine is kind of like a mini comic, and I will be talking more about those later on. And you may notice on my name tag, it says Mixed Nebel. That is my non-binary title at school. I'm gender fluid, and many of the characters I draw in my comics are also gender fluid. All right, now here I am, I should say here I am, and I am teaching the zine comics workshop. And with other students, this is in the days when we were actually allowed to have social gatherings, so we were close together. All right, now we can see, yes, these are the two books. Best American Comics 2019 and Best American Comics 2015. My work is in those, and those two books are also available at the library. I highly recommend them. There's a diverse array of talent in there and some of my favorite cartoonists. So I'm very honored to have my work included amongst them. And yes, I would say definitely check these out if you're interested in comics and you want to get a sense of all the different approaches to comics that you might see nowadays. Here's a brief sample of some of my work. This is part of a comic strip that I drew from 2012 to 2017. It was a daily online wordless comic strip. And in this particular strip, there's two characters meeting. They're happy to see each other, but then they realize they're stuck with each other. Here, two characters are reaching out towards each other, and in the end, they do connect. Here are two characters, when they touch hands, they form a sort of a star, which suggests the lighting of a tree. these two characters, when they meet, their wiggly beaks kind of intertwine. Here are two figures meeting and scrutinizing each other. And then when these two characters meet, you can see they touch their hands and also their feet if you follow the path of their bodies. Here we have the suggestion of a cloud that is in the shape of sort of a foliage of a tree that drifts away with outstretched hand. Sadness. Child with a kite and an animal becoming the kite. Snail rider. Catching a ball. Connecting to make a family. One face becoming two faces. Now I will start in with the inspiration of why I got into comics in the first place. I will mention that the first part of this presentation that talks about inspiration, I'm focusing mostly on the visual aspect of comics. And then in the next section that talks about creation of comics, I'll be going in more detail on words and pictures and the creation of a graphic novel. But starting with inspiration, these are the influences on my work: American comics, foreign comics, art books, and novels. Here's where it started for me. Some of you may recognize these little books. They were very popular in the 1970s. That's when I grew up. And I have three older sisters who collected them before I was born, so I was lucky to have them around the house for me to look at. And when I was 4 years old, I started reading them, but I didn't know how to read the words. So I would look at the pictures to figure out what was going on. And I remember the feeling I had when I first discovered these comics and started reading them was a feeling of really intense joy and a feeling of, this is something that I want to do. When I got a little older, I started clipping these comic strips from the newspaper. Here are some of the daily strips. And this is a Sunday strip from the Chicago Tribune. That's the paper my family subscribed to. We're from the Chicago area. And I love the pacing of this particular strip. If you look at the first two panels, it's the setup of Linus. He's pushing the snowball, making it bigger, then resting. And then two more panels of him pushing, leaning into it, putting all his effort into it, and then finally resting again. And then Lucy comes along and turns her brother into a sculpture, sort of modern art. And if you think about the pacing of it, the rhythm of figuring out how many pictures to use to show an action and how that changes the pacing of how you portray a scene. Here's what the Peanuts strip looks like amongst all the other strips, and you can see how it stands out. I love the use of negative space, which is that space all around the characters. It gives the strip, I think, kind of an open feeling. And I love the element of surrealism that is in the strip, of this floating Lucy around the pitcher's mound, and then finally behind a fence, she pops her bubble. Also, as a kid, I read a lot of Topolino. Topolino means little mouse in Italian. And my mother was Italian, and I grew up spending summers in Italy. So I would read Italian comics. There was a ritual in our house where the adults would nap after lunch. And so for a couple hours in the afternoon, all the kids were expected to be quiet so as not to wake up the adults. And they gave us stacks and stacks of comic books to read. So I was forced to read comics as a kid. And I read Topolino, and Geppo was another Italian comic I liked. Here are a couple pages from Geppo. My Italian was not that great. And so again, I was in the situation where I was looking at the pictures to figure out what was going on, similar to when I was 4 years old looking at the Peanut strips. When I was in high school, I started collecting comic books. Here is my comic book collection. You can see they're in boxes. They're all in little plastic bags inside. And I became interested in old comics and the history of comics and looking at how comics changed over the years. This is a comic section from 1938 from the Tonopah Daily Times and Bonanza. Here is a comic strip from 1930. This is a page from my comic book from the 1960s. And this is Raw Magazine from the 1980s when I was in high school. One of my sisters, when she came back from college, she found this magazine, she brought it back to me, and it made a pretty huge impression on me. If you look on the right, there's a sort of a pamphlet. That's a little comic zine or a mini comic, Mouse, Chapter 6. Every issue of Raw Magazine had a chapter insert of Mouse, and eventually those chapters were collected into book format as a graphic novel. And that graphic novel won a Pulitzer Prize, which was an important moment in the history of comics, because they started to get more recognition and more acclaim and more interest after that, that you could do things with comics that were, people were not expecting comics to be so dealing with issues that were kind of more serious. In this case, Mouse dealt with the author's relationship with his father and his father's description of the Holocaust during World War II. The publisher of Raw Magazine was Françoise Mouly, and you can see not only was she publisher, she was also co-editor with Art Spiegelman, who drew Mouse, and she also did the design and production. So this was very much her magazine, and I was impressed with what she did with it. She focused on a lot of really avant-garde work, American comics and foreign comics that were very strange. And here's an example of a Japanese comic. And again, it's kind of like a comics insert, a little zine within the magazine. And I was really fascinated by seeing how another culture, another country approaches comics. And I became interested in foreign comics. And I started to seek out as many foreign comics as I could see, and as many different types of comics that I could look at. Besides these avant-garde comics from Raw, I was looking at underground comics and alternative comics and any type of comic I could look at for inspiration. So for example, in the 1990s, I made a trip to the Philippines and I brought back a bunch of Filipino comics. These are graphic novel adaptations of a Filipino epic poem called the Ipong Adarna. These are some Mexican comics. I found these at a Mexican grocery store. Indian comics. I found these at an Indian grocery store. Many of these comics, they depict stories that are from the Hindu religion in a graphic novel format. And these are Japanese comics. I got these at a Japanese bookstore called Kinokuniya, which if you've ever been to Uwajimaya, the Japanese grocery store, you'll notice they have a bookstore in the back. That's here in Beaverton if you've ever been that way. Here are a couple pages from the manga, which is what they call comics in Japan. Sort of enigmatic imagery. This is a book of Japanese woodblock prints. And in addition to looking at comics, all these years I've also been looking at art books as comics. So for example, this is not a comic exactly, it's not a graphic novel, but it could be read as a comic. And I'll show you what I mean. When you open the book, this is what you see. So the artist behind these prints didn't necessarily intend for those pictures to be placed next to each other, but once they are placed next to each other, the mind wants to connect those pictures in some way and make a comic out of it. And so when I look at these, I think, is there a connection? And I see there's the curve of the bird's wing that is related to the curve of the road. And there's the perspective from the bird looking down. Maybe we see from the bird's perspective looking down at these figures below us. These two pages suggest a scene at some event in the evening, and I have no idea what's going on, but it's really mysterious and intriguing and beautiful. And I like that feeling of not necessarily knowing what's going on, but still being so intrigued and captivated. So this is that type of feeling that I get from looking at something like this. It's something that I was really hoping somehow to incorporate in my work. Here is another art book that made a really, really strong impression on me. Miro has a sketchbook that in this book is reprinted. And I love his drawings. They're so expressive. These characters, with just a few lines, they have so much emotional impact, I feel. Here are two scenes of a figure throwing a ball at a bird, interpreted in two different ways. You can see just the idea of freedom, of how you can depict the same thing. Like you can show a bird in so many ways. You can depict a person in different ways, or an action in different ways. To me, seeing this, I just felt so, just my imagination felt like it was kind of just open. You can draw any way you want to show how things are. It really opened up a lot for me. And these two drawings, they really, really blew my mind, because when you look at one and then the other, well, it's not a comic, because when Miro drew it, he wasn't intending it as sequential art. He wasn't thinking to himself, first this happens and then that happens. He was making these preparatory sketches for a painting called Lovers from 1925. But the person who made the book decided to place these two pictures together, and so it becomes sequential art, it becomes a comic. And so when I look at the two pictures, it looks like on the top, these two characters are about to kiss, and then on the bottom drawing, they kiss, and the face of one of those characters shifts down the body, outside of the body, to create a new figure, almost like a child has emerged from their joined figures as they kiss. And to me, this was one of the most amazing comics I'd ever seen in my life. And so I definitely thought to myself, I want to make comics like this. So you can see a bit of the influence. There's hair on the character that kind of travels down the back of that character and ends up on the hair of another character. A face that shifts from one side to another, creating a figure. A body pursuing a body within a body. A figure floating above a cloud, falling into a cloud, becoming a cloud. Ethereal shapes of figures floating past each other. A figure emerging from another figure. Parent and child. My cousin, Ugo Mario in Italy, he liked that comic so much he made a t-shirt out of it. Here's someone walking and one of their legs is shaking and they fall, but as they fall down that shaky leg. Growing figures that are actually melting into some figure's head. Feeling of mystery, not quite knowing what's going on. A head blooming from a figure. And that's it for the visual portion. I'm going to jump now into kind of a leap forward into novels. This is a novel that we were talking about that I'm making the graphic novel version of. And part of the reason why I had decided to go this route, in addition to pursuing just the sequential art, wanting to do a graphic novel, is because, well, in the first place, in the Peanuts comic strip growing up, there are a lot of references to war and peace. Over the years, as I was reading it as a kid, all the characters, they tend to discuss Tolstoy and War and Peace. And it turns out Charles Schulz's favorite book, one of his favorite novels, was War and Peace. And so growing up reading Peanuts, I did think to myself, someday I will read that book, War and Peace. And so I did read it. And not only did I love it, but I realized it would make a really great graphic novel. And so I was determined that I was going to do that. And in this next section, I will describe to you the process and the progress of how I made this graphic novel. So The creation stage was starting with script and going through sketches, first draft, and final draft. And I made a diary. This is my cartoonist diary starting in 2009, documenting the stages of development of what I was going through. So in March of 2009, I wrote a rough draft of my planned War and Peace comic. And I say, in my mind, I can picture the expressions of various characters in various situations. That'll be fun to draw. September of 2009, so this is about 6 months later, I spent the past week writing all the dialogue for my War and Peace comic book. I'm pretty excited to start drawing. March of 2010, so this is, again, 6 months later. I've been plagued with doubts about how I want the War and Peace comic book to look, but now I feel like I just have to go for it, plow forward, get it drawn. March 20, I've drawn many versions of the first page of the War and Peace comic book. Once I get through that first page, the rest of it has got to pour out of me. March 21st, I was up until 2 a.m. last night working on the comic book. I'm feeling good about it. March 22nd, I was working on my comic at the car service waiting area. The hours flew by quickly. March 23rd, I made a major breakthrough with my comic last night. I woke up this morning with a sore throat. And during this time when I was planning War and Peace, I was actually in grad school to become a speech language pathologist. And so this week that I documented was during my spring break. And jump forward to the summer of 2010, I get back to work on the book and I say, I have a new idea for the War and Peace comic book. July of 2010, thinking about the War and Peace comic book, my head tells me to go one way with it, but my gut tells me to go the other way. August, the more I draw the characters from War and Peace, the more they come alive. Still August of 2010, the kids watched as I was drawing my War and Peace comic. They say I draw so goodly. I haven't mentioned yet, but I do have 2 kids. And at the time I was drawing this in 2010, they would have been 4 and 7 years old. So they were running around the house as I was drawing comics. September, next month, actually, this is the next year. So 1 year later, 2011, this is after I graduated from grad school in the summer. I started drawing the new version of my War and Peace comic book. It's exactly the way I want it to be, finally. You may notice I'm referring to it as a comic and a comic book. In my mind, the idea of a comic or a graphic novel was interchangeable, but a more appropriate term would have been graphic novel. September 29th, I found a Joan Miro art book that I think will inspire me as I draw my War and Peace comic book. That is the art book that I showed you in a previous slide. October 26th, this is a bit later. During the past few days, I've been drawing some scenes from War and Peace that were extremely challenging to stage properly. I'd go to bed at night thinking, how am I gonna draw that? I'd figure it out in my head, and then I'd wake up in the morning ready to tackle it. October 27th, as I finished a scene tonight, I thought, I love it, I think it's great, but will I still love it in the morning? October 30, I woke up at 5 a.m. and spent 2 hours imagining how I'm going to draw the last scene of War and Peace. November 1st, 2011, 250 pages, takes about 15 minutes to read. November 2nd, I read the whole comic from beginning to end and decided to redraw a few pages here and there. November 13th, so far the War and Peace comic looks pretty awful online, so I'm going to have to fiddle with the format in order to make it more presentable. Here I am in the process of putting the comic online to a website called Blogspot. November 17th, as I continue to put my War and Peace comic online, I start to think, good, I like it. Will other people like it? Why wouldn't they like it? I think it's good. Will other people think it's good? May of 2012, so this is about 6 months later, I presented my comics to a crowd of drunks. They were extremely attentive and polite. So the story behind this is that after I placed the first draft of War and Peace online, my cartoonist friends in Portland, they had read it and they invited me to present it to a crowd in a bar. And so we had a screen where we projected images, and the group is called the Grid Lords. And what they would do is they'd have cartoonists every month presenting their comics. So that was great. And after the event, there were maybe 50 people in the audience, and a bunch of them came up to me and said, well, how can I buy this book? And I said, well, I'm not done with it. That was just the first draft. I still need to work on it. And in 2018, I spent over the course of about 8 months working on the second draft. And then finally, just this summer, I finished working on the third draft. And finally, it is finished. So just last week, I finished my third and final draft. And so now finally, it is ready for print. Here is what the script looked like when I first wrote out all the dialogue. And you can see all the revisions that I was making as I was changing the dialogue and changing what I wanted to put in, what I wanted to take out, and how to try to condense it and get the essential aspect of all the characters and their relationships. Here I am trying to figure out what to include and what not to include. Try to get the essence of what is being expressed, and figuring out also the rhythm of speech and the rhythm of the dialogue to make it sound right. Here are some of the early sketches for War and Peace. I wasn't sure how the characters are going to look like, and you can see I'm playing around with a brush. Here's an early sketch of a character called Pierre, and the very opening scene of the novel that I start with is Pierre meeting his friend Andre. And so you can see he's calling out, "Yoo-hoo, Andre, yoo-hoo." And Andre replies, you can see in the word balloon, "What brings you here to gay society?" And Pierre says, "I came to see you." Here I'm drawing in pencil sketches. Here I'm still figuring out how the characters are going to look. I had the idea to draw Pierre as kind of a bear with ears, bear ears, but I decided that was not a good idea. It's because one of the characters refers to Pierre as a bear, and I thought that might be interesting to have him look like a bear, but no, he's more human-like here. And I'm playing around a little bit with the background, and playing around a little bit with how much curly hair to give Pierre. And here I'm going back to trying to use a brush to see how that works compared to using ballpoint pen or different types of pens, playing around with backgrounds. And you notice, instead of using word balloons, I decided to have the dialogue above the characters. And here I decided what would happen if instead of using rectangle panels, how about if I use ovals as panels? There's some character sketches on the right there that show, I had this idea to draw the characters as sock bits because in one of the Peanuts cartoons, Snoopy is doing a reenactment of the entire War and Peace using puppets. So I thought, what if I portrayed the whole graphic novel as if it's being a puppet show by Snoopy acting it out with puppets? But I abandoned that idea. I thought there was a limitation to that. So I came back to characters and ovals. Here I had the idea of using computer lettering and a computer drawing of the ovals, but that didn't work. It made the characters look like amoebas in a petri dish. Here I made a big change. I decided to do 4 panels per page, 4 ovals per page instead of 3. And that changes the pacing of the whole rhythm of how you can present what's going on the page. So it's still 4 panels per page, this time going back to rectangles and figuring out how big the rectangles could be, placing the characters within the rectangles, trying out a little bit of color. Here I had the idea to get rid of the panels and just have the characters floating with their dialogue kind of above them. But then I realized, why are they floating? So I went back to the rectangle where they're standing on the bottom and playing around with the crowd scene to show that they're at a party when they first encounter each other. And finally narrowing it down to the entrance of Pierre as he makes it through the crowd to see his friend and call out, "Andre." Here are character sketches of some of the other characters. And I tried to give each character in the novel a distinctive look. Here's later on in the scene in the beginning where I introduce a character called Lisa. And Lisa and her husband, Andre, they have a quarrel, but I wanted to make sure that you like both characters. and you don't take a side in their quarrel, which was hard to make sure that all the characters are likable, but they are flawed. And here, Andre says goodnight to Lisa, kisses her on the forehead, and she goes to bed. So I will share with you the first 10 pages of War and Peace that are finally done. Just last week is when I finished redrawing. I did a lot of redrawing and rewriting over the years as I revised War and Peace, but I'm finally at a place where I'm happy with it. So here it is. Andre, Pierre, what are you doing here? I came to see you. How was college? Awesome. I learned so much. Good for you. What have you been up to? I joined the army. But why? I don't belong here. I have to go. You don't have to go. Hi, Lisa. Pierre, tell him he doesn't have to go. No one should go to war. We shouldn't even have war. Do women make war? No, it's men. Men are the problem. You should go to bed, Lisa. He's always pushing me away. She's always complaining. He can't stand the sight of me. Lisa, I know, I don't know. But Andre, you and Lisa, I think it'll be okay. Really? Maybe. Good night, Lisa. So hopefully I will have this book in print within a couple of years. And most likely, if I have a book release party in the area at a bookstore or a comic book store, I can let you know if you would like to find out what happens next to the rest of the book. And that leads me to my last section of the presentation, which is the publishing and marketing, starting with zines, the internet, and comic arts festivals. So these are comic zines. They're made mostly by a lot of my cartoonist friends. These are from about 15, 20 years ago. From 2000 to 2007, I was living in Oakland, California, and I was very closely involved with a group of cartoonists that was making zines. We would meet 2 or 3 times per week, and we would talk about comics, share comics, make comics together, and we'd go to events, zine festivals, comic arts festivals to sell and trade zines, and it was a great way to have a closeness to the community of cartoonists. I've been using the word cartoonist and I haven't defined it. So you may be wondering, what is a cartoonist? So a cartoonist is basically someone who writes and draws comics. Whereas if you're a comics writer, then you just write the comics. And if you just draw comics, you're a comics artist. But if you draw and write, you're a cartoonist. And frequently a cartoonist not only draws and writes the comic, they also do the publishing and the marketing. Here's the first book where my comic appeared. It's called Elf World. And here is the story that appeared in Elf World called The Little People, drawn by me and a friend of mine. I drew the outlines of the characters and rough sketches, the backgrounds. And then my friend Jesse, he did a detailed kind of painted version of that comic. Here's another page from that comic, from that book. I'll bring you a gift when I get back. No, I'll be gone when you get back. So that book was published in 2007, and that's the same year I moved to Portland, Oregon. And that, I can say, by the way, the reason that my comic was accepted into that book is because I believe my friend Jesse was friends with the publisher. And so the reason I got published in the first book I ever appeared in was because of my closeness to the cartoonist community. In 2012, I started putting my comics online. This is a website called Tumblr. And imagine if you're looking at your phone, this is how my comic would look like as you're scrolling through Tumblr to see what's on that website. And you can see all 3 panels of one page are able to fit on the screen that way. Whereas in Instagram, unfortunately, the space in that platform is only a square. So I could only fit 2 panels out of 3. It's kind of limiting as to how much of my art I can showcase on that platform. So I don't use Instagram very often. Twitter also I don't use very often because they give you a small rectangle to put artwork in. That's not enough space. Facebook, on the other hand, is okay because you get a full page of comics that you can place on there. So Facebook and Tumblr was how I got my artwork out there, and Tumblr is where I built an audience. After about a year of putting my comics on Tumblr, I got an email from a comics publisher in Chicago. And it was RJ Casey who contacted me and said he would like to publish a book collection of my comics, which was, to me, the greatest thing I could possibly have hoped for, because ever since I was a little kid, when I was 4 years old reading those Peanuts books, that's the thought that I had was, someday I want to make comics that are in a book like this, and here it is. Oh, by the way, this book is also available from the library. So thank you to Mark again for purchasing that for the library, and please check that out. 12 pages from Welcome, my book of comics, were accepted into Best American Comics 2015 by Bill Kartalopoulos, the series editor, and the author, Jonathan Lethem. Here is what Jonathan Lethem says about my work. Erik Nebel's Welcome is the pure essence. It's the only book my 4-year-old has ever read to me and to his older brother about a dozen times. This is another book that featured one of my comics. Around this time, there were actually a bunch of comics publishers that contacted me and asked me if they could publish some of my comics in their books. And so I won't share all of them, but, oops, did I freeze? I will share this one. And here is a page from that particular book, Lagon. It's published in Switzerland by some cartoonists, I believe, in Switzerland, and the book debuted in Paris in an art gallery. And the printing process is called risograph. You can tell it's a little bit different from your standard type of printing. And in this particular page, you can see the yellow creature on the bottom is holding a beak with a smile on it. And as he attaches that beak to the bird, you can see the bird will be happy once he has a smiling beak. Carousel Magazine was another place which featured my comic strips, which published them. From 2016, 2017, 2018, I drew comic strips for them. Here is one of my strips for Carousel. It was a literary arts magazine. This is the Walking Head. The art editor for Carousel Magazine invited me to participate in this book called 4-Panel Volume 2. And the premise is that every artist that participated had the same template of 4 panels. And this is what my story looked like, part of it for that book, Why Don't We Come Together? And that's the book. The publisher, Mark Liberty, is holding the book, and I'm next to him. And those are 2 other Canadian cartoonists with us at the Toronto Comic Art Festival, TCAF, TCAF is what they call it. It's one of the best and biggest comics festivals in North America. So I was very excited to go to this event where this book debuted. And at this event, I was able to meet some of my favorite comics publishers. Here they are talking at a panel. And you can see with the dark hair on one end is Annie Koyama of Koyama Press. She's published many wonderful graphic novels. And next to her, speaking in the microphone, is Françoise Mouly. And she is the publisher, or was the publisher, of Raw Magazine, which I showed you in a previous slide, that magazine that had made such an impression on me. She published Raw Magazine in the 80s. She published Raw Books in the 1990s. And then she went on to found and publish Toon Books, which is one of my favorite publishers of kids comics. So here, someone from the audience is asking, what advice would you give to a cartoonist who wants their work to be published? And the consensus is amongst all these comics publishers that please don't send us your unsolicited submissions. You need to get your work out there yourself. You need to publish your work in zines, and go to comic arts festivals to sell your zines. You need to put your comics online onto different websites like Tumblr and Instagram and Facebook. And once you become more well-known, then we'll see your work. And if we like it, we will contact you. Shortly after TCAF, that festival, I found out that my comics from the book that debuted at TCAF were accepted into Best American Comics 2019, edited by Jillian Tamaki. And here is a review of my work from that book. This is Kirkus Reviews. Erik Nebel's Why Don't We Come Together ingeniously explores the possibilities of a rigid format. Repeating but shifting shapes and colors, figures and patterns play across a set of equal-sized panels stacked into a grid, clicking through simple, whimsical stories like a film strip of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. And here are some panels from Why Don't We Come Together. It's been really great for me to see my work reviewed. There have been a bunch of people who have been writing articles about my work, and they've been interviewing me for magazines and for websites. And that's very, very important to me to see how people respond to my work and to see that they are enjoying it. I don't think I could continue as a cartoonist if I didn't get some feedback. And so when I go to festivals, I also will have people coming up to me and telling me that, oh, hey, I'm a huge fan of your work, and I've been watching it online. So I also am a cartoonist. Sometimes they'll show me their work, and they'll tell me, oh, I've been influenced by your work. And that to me is really special, to see their work and to be really impressed by beautiful work they're showing me that shows a little hint of something that they've gained from what I'm doing too. Also around this time, I found out that Toon Books was interested in publishing one of my comics in this book called Comics Easy as ABC by the cartoonist Ivan Brunetti. And as you can see, the editor is Francoise Mouly, who is the editor that I had seen at TCAF, the Comics Festival, and the editor of Raw Magazine that I had talked about earlier. So now I can say I'm in a book that was edited by Francoise Mouly. And here's the section that showcased short strips that included my strip. And here is the strip, Stormy Weather. Here is where I draw comics. It's the dining room table where I am right now. And I just use paper and pen. And after I'm done drawing, I scan it onto a computer. And if I add color, I can use Photoshop to add color. Otherwise, the basics are right here. All I need to continue doing what I do really are the pen and the paper and some time. And I actually enjoy the act of drawing with a pen that has a little ball on the end. That's why they call it a ballpoint pen. But when you roll that little ball on the page and you feel the ball rolling and the ink releasing onto the page, I enjoy the feeling of that. And I think the pleasure is an important part of why I continue to create. If I didn't have pleasure creating, I don't know how motivated I would be to continue being a creator. Which leads me to my closing statement, which is that to be a creator or to engage in a project that requires a large commitment of years of your life, I think it requires more than just self-discipline. I think you need to have a strong faith in what you're doing and believe that what you're doing is really meaningful. And I also think you have to believe that what you're doing has a higher purpose. And for me, the higher purpose, I think, has been the hope that my work gives people that feeling of inspiration that I got that gave me such intense joy way back when I was 4 years old. And I fell in love with comics for the first time. So that's my story. And I would love to answer any questions you have that have been brought up by anything I said. I will open it up to Q&A, and I'll let you take over Is anyone, I will let you, is it Sheila, would you like to moderate, or Laura, are you moderating for the Q&A? Mark, I don't know if you wanted to shift to like a gallery view, or people can maybe raise their hands if they have a question, if we see them in the...
I have a quick question.
Oh, okay, Sheila, yeah.
So you mentioned cartoonist writes and draws, and an
Mm.
artist draws, and then you mentioned somebody writes. Who would write who is not also an artist?
Right. So there are people who prefer just to write comics, and I would say for the most part, comics writers, they tend to do more commercial work. So in other words, work that is, you're more likely to have large groups of people collaborating on a comic, usually making a comic for a corporation that owns the characters. So for example, Marvel and DC, who own a bunch of characters, they would hire a writer and a penciler and an inker and a letterer and a colorist and an editor and a whole team of people to make a comic, versus a cartoonist who does it all by themselves. And occasionally you will have a cartoonist or someone who might collaborate with a friend who maybe the two of them, they are both cartoonists, and they decide, like, why don't we collaborate, like the way that I did with my friend Jesse, and the two of us did that comic together where I wrote it and drew it, and then he did the rest of the drawing. But yeah, I would say the other change that's happened recently, like in the past 5 years, is that the young adult market and the kids market for graphic novels has grown so huge that now you're more likely to have people that maybe are comics writers that are writing for kids and young adults. And sometimes what they'll do is they'll get writers who are already popular writing novels, and they'll see if those writers are interested in writing graphic novels. And,
so
yeah.
What would that look like?
Oh, right. So let's see. The kinds of graphic novels for kids that are being made these days, or the kinds of collaborations?
The kind of collaboration, what the writing looks like. I mean, you showed the page of dialogue. Is that
right?
Is that what it would be like, sort of
Yes.
dialogue page?
Yes. There's two ways of doing it. There's two ways of writing a comic. The writer sometimes will just write out the script and have no drawings attached to it, and it's all just written words that the artist can interpret and make it into a comic. And the other way of doing it that some writers like to do is they like to draw sketches of what's going on in the comic each page as a suggestion to break down the pacing of each page. But frequently a comics writer will just write the script and kind of leave it kind of open to the artist to interpret that script as best they can. So depending on the skill of the artist, it can either come out really well or not so well. Yeah.
Erik, I have a couple of questions.
Yeah.
One, where do you get your ideas from?
Well, so when I wasn't adapting the novel War and Peace, that was the source of ideas for that particular graphic novel. And I do have a couple other graphic novel projects where I'm adapting graphic novels. And so in that case, definitely I'm getting my ideas from the source of a novel. But when I was doing the comic strips, where it was mostly the images and coming up with different ideas for those strips, I used a kind of a strategy called automatic drawing, and it was popularized by the surrealists in the early 20th century. And the idea behind it is that you draw without thinking what you're drawing. And so I would sit down and I would just let my hand kind of move along the page and do whatever it wanted to do without thinking about it. And then after I was done with the drawing, I would look at what I had drawn and interpret it and think, that looks like it could be a figure, or this looks like someone is doing something. And so I would do another drawing kind of loosely based on that automatic drawing. And then looking at that drawing, it would come up with new ideas. And so it's mostly almost like one thing leads to another. As long as you keep drawing and as long as you keep kind of coming up with different ideas that as you look at the page, it makes you think of other things. There's always like a progression where you may start with one idea, but it leads to a succession of many, many other ideas. So that's the process that I use.
Okay, and the other quick question that I have for you is, when you read some of the dialogue that you wrote, when you start writing the dialogue, do you have a group of other writers that you work with so they can read it, so you can listen to it, or you just do your dialogue by yourself?
I do it by myself. I think it would be a good idea to try to do that type of activity with a group of people, to have them act out dialogue. I did participate in this group once. This was a while ago in Portland. It was called Comics Underground, and they would have monthly meetings where they would have the audience participation, and so they would project comics onto a screen, and then the audience would act out the dialogue to each character. That's kind of a fun way of seeing how your dialogue is interpreted by actual people. But yeah, it is a good way to like have people read it out loud. I would say the most feedback that I would get from cartoonist friends is that usually it would tend to focus on the visual aspects and less so on the dialogue and the writing. And so on the get-togethers I have with my friends who are artists, when we do kind of comment on each other's work, it's interesting that you point out the idea of thinking about the dialogue versus the art. It makes me think a little bit more about how I should proceed further. That it might be a good idea to our next gathering to think about maybe acting out dialogue that we have if we're coming up with scripts.
Yeah, because I know that sometimes when we have critiques in our group, and people have critiqued my work, they give me an idea that I never thought about before, so I kind of add that into it.
Yeah. Sounds good.
All right, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I have a question. So are you looking for books that are out of copyright, or how does that work? Because War and Peace at one point would have been under copyright, and you mentioned that you're working on other books. So do you worry about the copyright aspect?
Yes. In fact, when I was thinking about different projects, I was searching for novels or stories that are 100 or 200 or 1,000 years old is what I was looking at, so that I wouldn't have to worry about the copyright issue. Yes.
Okay.
Erik, how did you decide which characters and how many characters to include in War and Peace? There were probably more in Tolstoy's novel than what you put in your comic, but I'm not sure. Maybe you used them all. Or did you kind of condense them?
You're right. I had to cut some characters out. In my initial first draft, when I wrote out all the dialogue, when I was writing out all the dialogue, just typing it out on the computer and that first draft, I tried to include all the characters in War and Peace, like every single one. And so that turned out to be, if I was going to make a comic out of that, that would be, 2,000 pages long. So I did decide that if I were going to try to condense it, that not all the characters would be in the novel. That was a very hard choice to figure out some of the characters that I loved that weren't going to make it into my version. But yeah, that was part of the struggle. That was part of the challenge, is figuring out, how to make it capture the spirit of the novel, but also to interpret it in a kind of a drastically different way. Hopefully people who have read the novel, who read the comic, will say that, yes, I was faithful to the spirit of the novel. I really wanted to really capture what I loved about the novel and not forget about that. And so anyone who liked it would like my comic.
Thank you. About what percentage of characters do you think you included overall?
Wow. So I would say that in my final version of War and Peace, I have under 20 characters, whereas in Tolstoy's War and Peace, there are probably 100. Yeah, but I would say Tolstoy has 30 central characters, and so maybe even 25 central characters. So I didn't have to cut out maybe 5 or 6 of the main characters so 20 out of 25. That's not bad, I guess. Yeah.
Pretty good. I look forward to reading that. When do you think it'll be published?
So the process that's gonna happen is basically I'm going to scan all the artwork online onto onto like very high quality scans so that it's ready to be printed. And then I'm going to print out maybe 10 copies, kind of sample copies of the book. And I'm going to send them out to friends of mine who are just in the comics community or in the comics industry in general. And I'll ask them, who in the comics industry do you think would be most interested in this as a graphic novel? And based on what they say, then if they come up with some publisher or some idea of someone who's associated with a publisher, they say, oh, I know exactly the person that should see this. Then I would ask them, oh, well, can you go ahead and show it to them and see what they think? Because, you know, previously when I was telling you comics publishers don't like you to submit directly to them, as long as you have someone like a friend of theirs that you can kind of go around and not submit directly to them, as long as someone else can show them your work, then it's a way of kind of getting other people to look at your work in a way, in a kind of indirect way. And so after that process, I'll figure out who's interested in publishing the book and go from there. If there's more than one person interested, figure out like what's the best fit, you know, which publisher would work best for me. And then usually from the time that the publisher agrees to publish and then it gets published, there's usually at least a year. And so I would suspect at least 2 years before you're going to see the book in print. Yeah.
And you started in 2010, I believe.
That's right. Yes. So it's a long process. And I have one book that I started back in the 1990s. I started work on one of my graphic novels, and I'm still working on that one. I actually have, yes, 3 or 4 different graphic novels that I've been working on for a long, long time. And I'm trying to wrap those up. Yes.
It's exciting to hear that because, you know, a lot of people who aren't writers, who aren't cartoonists, think it just happens immediately.
Yeah.
And it was really inspiring to be able to read your journal. You know, I do children's picture books, and the trajectory is about the same. You know, I'm looking at 10 years once I get my books polished. And I'm excited to check out Toon Books too, for kids, kids. So thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, that's interesting to hear that's pretty common, I think. Yeah, to have a project that will last years and years. Yeah, I imagine most people think it's more instant than that.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Thinking of the books for kids, one of my kids was really, really slow to learn to read and just didn't like the little children's books that he had to read. And he picked up some, what I thought of as comic versions of Hamlet and other famous stories and plays, and he was away. So it's kind of interesting to hear that you're doing a version of War and Peace. And
yeah.
that sort of thing made him learn to read.
Yeah. I love the idea of kids being able to read my book too. A lot of times I will be making a comic where I don't specifically have a target audience in mind. Like I don't necessarily think this is going to be for kids or adults. Usually it's adults that read my comic, but then when kids get a hold of it, it turns out they really love it too. And that, it turns out, is not exactly the route that you're supposed to take. When you go into book publishing, the first thing an agent will tell you is you need to target your work specifically to a demographic. So for example, I don't have an agent because when you work with comics publishers, you don't need an agent. But if I were going to work for a book publisher, then you do need an agent, absolutely. And so the difference would be that a major book publisher would be the ones that are like Scholastic, that publish something like this, you know? And the way that the agent describes it is that if you're making a comic for kids, your target audience is not kids. Your target audience is parents and teachers and librarians who will get books for the kids. And so that's who you're making the comic for. So it's kind of like a shift in kind of like the creative process where it's something that I'm not used to, this idea of targeting specific work for a commercial purpose. So my hope is just that there will be, you know, maybe people who like my work, but I'm not worried too much about the commercial aspect of it. So yeah, that's where I'm coming from.
You talked
just
about
wanna-
the Toronto Comic Arts Festival. Do you have any plans in the future to have to be a vendor at the Rose City Comic Con, which is here, you know, as you know, is held here in Portland, and comic artists are featured fairly robustly there, such as Dark Horse Comics and so forth. So would we see you there in a year or two, presumably when, you know, face-to-face type of comic cons and things like that resume?
I was actually at the Rose City Comic Con when my book first came out, that book of comics, Welcome, because my publisher, my publisher, RJ Casey, what he did was he went to all sorts of Comic Cons and comic festivals all around the country. And so I would join him when I could. And so I went to Comic Cons and I went to comic festivals. Now the difference between something like a Comic Con and a comic festival is that when I went to the Rose City Comic Con, for example, there were a lot of people dressed up in costumes, which is, it's very common in the Comic Con. But if you go to a comic festival, it's usually no costumes, and it's usually just comics and no TV or movie stars. Whereas the Comic Con has a lot of kind of popular type of entertainment featured, and some comics too. And so it's almost like two parallel worlds, the Comic Con and the comic festival. And my publisher, when he goes to Comic Cons, he believes that he's less likely, or at that time he told me he thought he was less likely to sell his books, his comics, his graphic novels at a Comic Con. He told me he had a better luck at comic art festivals. And so there are some cartoonists that go to Comic Cons, and then there's some that just avoid them completely and only go to the comic arts festivals. And Portland used to have a fantastic comic arts festival for a while, but I think the people who organized it just realized it was too much work. So for some reason, Portland has not had recently a very big comic arts festival. We do have the Comic Cons. Yeah. I personally love both of them. I love the Comic Con. I think those costumes are fantastic. I love going to a Comic Con and seeing all those people dressed up. It's so much fun, I think, and seeing all the movie stars, you know, and being able to meet a movie star. You have to wait for hours in line, but then you get to see these famous people. So
it's great fun. I've been to both, and they're both great fun. And it just seems like with your graphic novel coming out for War and Peace, it seems like that would be such a good venue for the exposure to it. But I guess you have to go with your gut instinct as regards how you're going to market it once it is actually published and out there. But yes, I agree with you. Both have their, both are very charming. Yes.
Yeah, definitely.
Erik, did you go to the IndieCon that was here in Portland last year?
Oh, right. I heard about that. You know what? That sounded pretty good. Did you go?
I did go. Yeah. It seemed more like Stumptown. I think you were referring to Stumptown.
Yeah, Stumptown, and then like for a couple of years there was like something called Line Work Festival that was after Stumptown. But yeah, Stumptown was good. And what did you think of it? What's it called? The
IndieCon. I suspect the whole COVID thing is going to make it very hard for them to do that again.
Yeah.
Because it was pretty shoestring as it was, but there were a lot of great people there. So I hope they can do it again.
Yeah, that would be great. Yes, I would definitely get involved with that.
Erik, do you ever go to any zine events?
I do. Portland has a fantastic zine symposium. I love it.
Yeah.
That is wonderful.
I go to that.
Yeah. And well, if you've never been to a zine festival, those are really wonderful. Just the act of being able to see the variety of different types of people making different types of zines. And I actually loved earlier when I was with my friends, kind of going to zine fests and selling my zines. I really loved just the feeling of sitting at the table and having random strangers come up to my table and see my comics for the first time and some people just instantly liking them and some of them not liking them, and just realizing, you know what, it's kind of random. I couldn't tell that's the type of person that would like my comic and that person is not going to like my comic. It's a very interesting experience for a creator to have that instant kind of reaction of someone who is seeing your work for the first time and just look at their face and see how they react to it. It's really, if you've never done that before, it's just kind of, it's a little bit nerve-wracking at first. I think I was very anxious the first time I started doing these zine fests, but then you get used to it and you realize those people that don't like your comic, they're not bad people. They're just, they just need a little bit of I don't know, exposure to
Brainwashing.
Yeah.
When you go to the zine fests, how do you publish your comics? Do you publish them by yourself or do you go through a publisher?
For when I was making zines more often, I haven't made a zine very much recently, but when I was making zines kind of more on a regular basis, I would make the zine myself, and then I would try to have a table with other friends of mine, and so that way I could hang out with my friends as I'm selling zines. And sometimes friends, oh, you know what? Actually, there's a friend of mine who has organized his own zine fest. It's every few months. It's called what's it called? Frankenstein Comic Swap. And then in the evening, I forget what it's called, but it's in Portland. And I think through Floating World Comics, which is a really great comic store in Portland. I think the owner of Floating World, I think, also promotes that. And another great store is Cosmic Monkey in Portland. And Cosmic Monkey and Floating World, they carry zine. And so if you don't have a time to go to a zine festival and you go to those two comic stores, you could actually ask the owner, like, hey, where's the zine section? And you could see a lot of interesting kind of homemade, handmade comics there.
So do you just Xerox them or
Yeah,
how do you
exactly.
fix them?
Yes, when I was making zines, I would just go to the copy store and we would just make copies. I usually make about just 50 copies when I was making zines, not very many, because I would usually sell between 30 and 40 copies at the zine festival. So I usually wouldn't overprint more than what I thought I could sell. So very, very limited print run. It's ideal for the copy machine, yeah.
And my other follow-up question here is, have you ever thought of publishing on your own your graphic novels, or do you want to go through a publisher? What's the advantage of one or the other?
Yes, that's something I consider a lot. So I have a friend who recently, what he did was he decided to self-publish a book of his comics. And he realized that what he could do was just ask Floating World Comics to carry it. And so he would just print out, I guess it's print on demand. So he only has to print out maybe 10 copies. And then he'll give 5 copies to the comic book store and not have to worry about having, a print run of, whatever it is, 1,000 copies or 500 copies if you go through a major printer. And so printing your own book is pretty feasible. The other reason why it's feasible is through Kickstarter. Many, many graphic novels. In fact, someone told me recently that Kickstarter is the biggest comics publisher of today. The more comics are published through Kickstarter than anything else as far as graphic novels. So you have a lot of creators who will self-publish or publish with a group of friends and go through Kickstarter and get money to pay for their graphic novel that way and send it out that way. So I have thought about that. I would say that the advantage of having a comics publisher work is, for me, that oftentimes what I find is that when I have a comics publisher that has published my work instead of me publishing it on my own, is that, for one thing, they are the ones that organize the appearances at different events. And so I don't have to go to the trouble of kind of reserving a table at a comic arts festival because my publisher is already there. So I just have to show up. So it takes a lot of time off, frees up a lot of time for me. And so that's one advantage. The other advantage is that I do think that when you're published by a comics publisher, that it gives a sense of people thinking like, all right, if someone kind of put the investment of time and money into this person, then at least that comics publisher believes in them. And if you like the kinds of comics that this publisher publishes, then you may be more inclined to buy all the comics from that publisher. So for example, Fantagraphics, which is in Seattle, and Fantagraphics Underground, they publish a lot of comics, and I'm inclined to basically buy everything they publish, because I think that I like the kinds of comics that they have published. So when you are involved with a comics publisher that has a following, you may have instant access to readers that just think like, well, I like everything else from that publisher, I'll try this person too. So that's another definite advantage of comics publishers. The only thing you have to be careful about whenever you get published by anyone else is that you have to make sure that you retain all ownership of what you do. So you want to make sure you have copyright of everything that you've made. And also you want to retain all the rights, media rights, so that, for example, if your comic gets sold to, I don't know, like gets optioned for being made into a movie or a TV show, you want to make sure that you get that money and not the comics publisher. So there's a couple things you have to be careful about.
The other question I have is, when you publish your work online, when you said on Tumblr and other, like on Facebook, do you worry about copyright on your own work so that nobody else takes your idea and goes with it? Has that ever come up?
I'll tell you, all I know about copyright was based on a lecture that I attended from a copyright lawyer. And that was back, I'm assuming the information I got is still current unless they've made major changes in copyright law. But back when I was living in San Francisco, there was an institution called the Cartoon Art Museum. And what they would do is every year, they would, not every year, more than once a year, they would have guest lecturers and meetings for all the cartoonists. And one year, the guest lecturer was a copyright lawyer. And he told us all we needed to know about copyright, which is kind of a long speech, but I can give you the short version of it, which is that, according to what he said, when you publish and you put your name to something, whether it's online or in a zine or in a book, you don't even necessarily have to have that magical C, like copyright. As long as you say, by you, you automatically are establishing and showing to the world that this is yours. And so it helps to have like copyright, your name, and the date, just to kind of like solidify if it ever comes up when you published it. So that is a good thing to put like copyright, your name, and the date. But you don't have to do anything else besides that to have copyright of your work. There's nothing extra great length you have to go to. That's the basics of it, is just to have your work and your name attached to it. Now what happens online is that people will share comics and they won't necessarily share who made the comic. And so they might, if there's a name attached to a comic, some people will actually just kind of erase the name and then start sharing that comic, and no one knows who made it, right? So what happened was there was a real outcry online amongst artists that were furious over this happening. And so there's been definitely more of an effort I've seen to make sure that there's more kind of overseeing of the fact that people aren't doing that people aren't erasing the name of the person who made the artwork. So usually these days when I see a comic online, I will see the name of the person who made it. And if you don't see the name, then it means that's not good. It means that someone along the way just kind of like tried to take off that name. So it hasn't happened to me really, because whenever something gets shared that I put online, they always say it's from my website. So it's acknowledged, like the source is acknowledged from ericnebel.tumblr.com. So people always know where it came from. So I haven't had that problem with my work.
Well, this has been great, Erik. I mean, not just for people who want to do comics, but all the things that you've gone through, they cover all the things that affect us all with writing as well, whatever type of writing we do.
Good, I'm so glad. It's great. Good to hear
That's
that.
a fantastic presentation. Thank you.
Oh, I'm so glad. Thank
And
you
your
so
pictures
much.
are gorgeous.
Wow, thank you. Thank you. I really enjoyed
Yes,
it.
thank you, Erik.
Thank
You
you.
are so inspired, and you have inspired us too. Please let us know when your masterpiece War and Peace is published, so we can maybe attend your launching party.
Yeah,
I would love that.
And for
Thank you
sure,
so much.
buy the book.
Oh, thank you. I would love that. That would make me really, really happy. I look forward to seeing you again when that happens, or maybe even before then too. But thank you for that.
So
Thank you.
thank you for coming today. This has been
Yeah.
wonderful.
Thank you.
Hey.
Thanks everyone. Yeah.